Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Praxis Australia webinar. This session we'll be talking about eConsent, and we've got a fabulous list of panelists who will be talking us through some of the issues, some of the opportunities, and also some of the challenges. And eConsent is something that we've been talking about in Australia for at least the last decade, yet we've been very slow to adopt it. And that includes other technologies like things such as broad consent that are used for research using database information and also stored samples. So we'll talk about some of that today. I'll just wait until everybody has joined. We'll give everybody a few more minutes, and then we shall keep moving. The recording will be made available to all of our registrants after the session. And there will be a quick poll at the end as well, where we'll be asking you just to provide some feedback to us on these sessions so that we can continue to improve them as we move forward. All right, we might move on because we do have a lot to get through as always. So firstly, Praxis acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands that we all gather and work on across the country, wherever you may be, and we acknowledge their connection to land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. And of course, we'd also like to thank the sponsors of this webinar series, which include Sophie Meffam, GCP, MTP Connect, the New South Wales Health Office for Health and Medical Research, SA Health Medical Education and Training Unit, and Health Translation SA. A little bit of housekeeping, and for those who have joined us on multiple occasions, you will be well and truly used to this by now, but just to reiterate that your mics will be muted and your videos are off. If you'd like to ask questions, and we really do encourage interaction, if you could please use the Q&A panel so that we can collate the chats through that channel, that would be fantastic. And we will be asking questions during the session, as well as a dedicated Q&A session at the end. So today we're talking about the changing face of consent to research. We will briefly discuss dynamic and virtual consent, but mostly the focus is around eConsent and the opportunities that are presented, and particularly in the face of COVID, where we have seen a more hopefully rapid move towards some of these technologies, which can improve our efficiencies and make research more accessible to more people across more regions across Australia. But a disclaimer, as always, that the webinar is designed really to provide a forum for discussion, and the views of our panellists don't necessarily always represent the organisations for which they work for, and that we always suggest that if you need additional guidance, you consult your HREC and RGO. So a quick introduction to our panellists today. So we have Ian Kerridge. Ian's from University of Sydney, Royal North Shore Hospital, and is one of our founding directors at Praxis. And Ian's going to be doing a bit of an overview of the current landscape. So thanks for joining us, Ian. We also have Rebecca Saunderson. Rebecca is a dermatologist and also CEO of Consentic. And Rebecca's going to talk us through the Consentic model and the opportunities that it presents. And for those who haven't actually seen an eConsent platform in practice, this will be a really good opportunity for you to see how easily and how effective these platforms can be adopted and adapted to your research. We also have Nick Zepps, and Nick is probably known to many of you through his role as Research Director at Epworth, and also his previous roles at St John of God in Western Australia. And Nick's going to be talking about his practical application of an eConsent platform and talk us through how it works in the clinic. And we also have Leanne Weeks, who's the Program Director of CTIQ. And Leanne's going to talk about some of the work that CTIQ has done in this space in particular, in the paper that they released last year. So welcome to you all. But first of all, a quick poll, and we want to find out what are the kinds of challenges that you're facing currently in regards to the application and the utility of eConsent. So I'm just going to launch that poll. And if I could ask you to take a few minutes, and this is a multiple choice, so you can select more than one option. Thank you. Everybody's started now. That's great. We'll just give it about 45 seconds. Excellent, thank you. Another few seconds. Okay, we'll end it there. Okay, so let me just share these results with you. So the biggest challenges are lack of understanding about how to use or modify eConsent. So 51% of you mentioned that that's your biggest challenge, followed by access to applicable platforms, and then participant accessibility issues. So that's something, both those issues we will be discussing today. So that's great. So thank you very much for those insights. Okay. So we've got a couple of presentations today. Firstly, I'm going to hand over to Ian, who's going to just give us a bit of a verbal update on the landscape. And then Rebecca's going to show us a quick presentation and a demonstration. Nick's going to then talk about eConsent in the clinic, as I mentioned, and then Leanne's going to give us a quick verbal summary on CTIQ. So there won't be slides for each of these presenters except when we get to Rebecca, just as a warning, so no need to be firing questions about that you can't see the screen. So Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Melanie, and welcome again, everybody, to the webinar on the changing face of consent. I hope that everybody's safe and well. So I'm going to just offer some general comments, a preamble, if you will, to this issue. So consent for research has looked pretty much the same actually now for about 70 years. So research participants are given information, written or verbal forms. They're given time for some questions, then they sign a form, and all looks good, research proceeds. And that's, it is, or it's at least it's imagined to be, the ethical sharp end of research. It involves respect for the person, it recognises their autonomy, it creates trust in a relationship, it actualises principles laid out in Nuremberg and in the Declaration of Helsinki and in our own national statement, and it seems to coincide with the law. So it all seems all very straightforward. Unfortunately, it's never actually proven that simple, and consent continues to be practically, philosophically and technically problematic. Capacity is assumed and rarely assessed. Consent is rarely completely voluntary. Understanding is low at best, and what data we have suggests that people struggle to understand the purpose of research and factors like blinding and randomization and even the risks of the research that they're about to agree to. Misunderstanding of law and ethics has made PIFs longer and larger, to the extent that they're almost the length of trial protocols themselves, and consent is not future-proofed and it's culturally specific. And finally, it's also still static, so it doesn't take account of the changing face both of research and the changing sort of values or ideas that people may have themselves. And I think we've been slow to change, and even the changes we've made, for example, the change from specific task-oriented consent to broad or unspecified consent for future research have, at least in my view, been ethically and legally dubious. And I think good for sponsors and biobanks and researchers, but arguably have got little to do with ethics and little understanding about what consent means. Those latter comments might be a little bit inflammatory, and I don't apologise for that at all, but hopefully it'll get people fired up in some way. And you might sort of fire off some emails to Melanie. That's all right. So COVID-19 has, without question, dropped a cigarette butt down our ethical trousers. It's forced us to leap about looking for solutions or different ways of thinking about consent. Now, it's not created problems necessarily with consent. Rather, it's just exposed the need for new thinking. Now, we've certainly done new thinking in relation to research in this sort of COVID era, if you want, reducing requirements for site visits, and enabling remote data capture, increasing the possibility of local blood draws and imaging, and optimising telehealth visits, all because we're trying to reduce risks, maintain research and conduct new research. But it's arguably also a time then for us to look at consent, and particularly the use of e-platforms to obtain, to revise, to modify and to withdraw consent, both to single projects but also to future unimagined, at least at that stage, projects as well. And that's what this webinar's about. It's looking at the opportunities and the challenges of new approaches to consent. So as we hear from Rebecca and Nick and Leanne, I'd like to suggest that we try and focus on a few questions or issues to consider. The first is that I think we should not minimise the challenge involved. This is not simply about changing from a paper form to an electronic one. It's about cultural change, and it's about transformation of the very notion of research. Second is we shouldn't assume the technological changes we put in place in response to COVID should remain. They still need to be proven to be better in order for them to persist. Something set up at this time is not just a sufficient basis for its permanence. The third is that we shouldn't replicate existing problems. And Grady noted in a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on consent in 2017, and I'll read this quote because it's so lovely. Simply replacing long, complex, technically written forms with long, complex, technical or legalistic electronic forms does not represent progress. And I think that's undoubtedly true. And finally, I think we should be expansive in our reimagining of what consent could look like, but at the same time, we need to avoid hubris. If we genuinely take up the possibilities of technology, of eConsent and of dynamic consent, we can actually transform not just consent, but also the way that researchers engage with participants and the extent of public participation in science. So this is arguably, in my view, a transformative moment. But at the same time, we should not fool ourselves into thinking that the problem, if you want, of consent will be solved or fixed, because illness, hope, human fallibilities, fear, none of these things can be fixed by numbers, by education, or by technology. They're persisting challenges, and they remain despite the ways that we may reimagine consent. So I'll stop there, and I hope that that's some type of preamble or introduction. Thanks, Melanie.
Thanks, Ian. That's great. And yeah, a really interesting analogy there about cigarette butt down the pants of research, but in typical Ian Kerridge style. But look, some really important points to add to the discussion, and it would be great if we can have some really robust discussion around some of those points that Ian has highlighted. So Rebecca, now I'm going to hand over to you if you'd like to share your screen and your presentation. Excellent. That's great, Rebecca. Fantastic. Your go.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell you about Consentic, which is an e-consent platform for both clinical trials and also for medical procedures. But I want to first take you back to the year 1524, and this is the first consent form that we know about. And this was an agreement between a surgeon and a non-Muslim who was living in the Ottoman state, that the surgeon would extract bladder stones and the citizen would pay 300 silver coins. In the event of something going wrong, he agreed not to litigate, and this was all signed under Sharia law. But when we fast forward almost 500 years, if anything, consent, I would say, has possibly regressed. Here is a fairly typical participant information and consent form. This particular one is no less than 15 pages long, and I'm not necessarily sure it does a better job at conveying information to patients in a way that they understand exactly what the trial is about. We know that the clinical trial consent process is dissatisfying for patients, and consent is a leading reason for poor recruitment into clinical trials. The lengthy consent forms lead to poor understanding, and many patients feel that they're quite terrified of the risks that are mentioned. Additionally, we know that 90% of clinical trials do not recruit to their deadlines. And one of these reasons, as mentioned, is due to the complex forms. Another issue is that often these forms are not culturally diverse. They're often in English, and consequently, trials often do not recruit patients from minority or non-English speaking backgrounds. And consistently, trials have been shown to not have diversity within them that meet the population levels of diversity, which raises a question as to whether or not the results are truly generalizable. The cost of poorly done consent is also huge. 94% of clinical trials are delayed by at least 1 month, and whilst some research centres don't appreciate these costs, for companies this can lead to $600,000 to $8 million every single day of delay. And obviously, if we don't have pharmaceuticals out in the market or medical devices, there's a lost revenue opportunity as well. But eConsent is not just converting paper-based forms into an electronic document, as Professor Kerridge alluded to. That process would only replicate deficiencies in the current process. eConsent, in my view, is using electronic and multimedia to ensure consent is simple, understandable, patient-centric, and of course accessible, which is highly important in COVID-19. Now, when we look at the literature since the 1980s, there have been studies showing that audiovisual media, when used to supplement consent processes, leads to much better patient understanding and satisfaction. So Consentic is essentially an e-consent platform with customized consent animations, followed by an interactive checklist that the patient agrees to the risks of the clinical trial before they sign a secure electronic consent form. In the interest of time, I can't show you a full animation, but I will show you a short excerpt. But the way it works is the clinician is selected, or the researcher, the clinical study, and then the patient will watch an animation. So I'm just going to show you a short excerpt.
Because you are having joint replacement surgery, you have been invited to take part in a research study called the My Mobility Clinical Study at Epworth Healthcare, run by surgeon Mr. Camden Farry and Zimmer Biomet. This video will outline the important things you need to know about the study to help you decide whether you would like to participate. My Mobility is an iPhone app that will try to help patients prepare and recover from surgery. After your surgery, you will need physiotherapy and education to help you recover. The aim of this study is to compare rehabilitation and education delivered by the My Mobility app versus education and physical therapy without the app. If you agree to be in this study, you will be involved for between 13 to 17 months.
In the interest of time, I'll continue, but that's a snapshot of how the animation is bespoke and can more simply convey the consent process to patients. After that, they'll agree to the risks before signing their electronic consent form, which is converted into a PDF. We have done a study showing one of our animations in a dermatological surgical technique called Mohs micrographic surgery. So the patients were either randomized to watch an animation or to have their doctor explain the procedure. And compared to the doctor's explanation, patients had much better understanding, particularly of the risks of the procedure, and it saved the doctor's time. 4 out of 5 patients preferred the video to their doctor's explanation. So benefits of eConsent are that it can improve recruitment. Obviously, the information delivery is in a far more patient-centric way. It improves engagement and comprehension. And with eConsent, obviously one can email it to patients so they can watch it in their own home, making it more accessible. For trial centres, our early data is suggesting that this is saving 2 to 3 hours per consent per patient, which for a large phase 3 clinical trial can save up to $300,000 in staff time, which obviously then can improve the productivity of a unit. And being paperless is obviously good for the environment. I think remote consent capabilities during COVID-19 are really important, but I also think that it's important post-COVID-19 as it increases flexibility. So really what we're trying to do is condense these complex forms into something that is patient-centric and understandable. So I'll finish there, and I look forward to a discussion later.
So Melanie, I think, yeah.
Sorry, yep, there we go. Can you see the screen again, everyone? Yep, fantastic, fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca, that's great. And I guess a disclaimer from Praxis's perspective as well is that we're not necessarily endorsing Consentic as a model. What we wanted to do today was to offer an opportunity for the audience to see that there is an Australian platform available. In fact, there is more than one eConsent platform available in Australia. But this is really about showing and having a discussion around what are some of the challenges to implementation, but also importantly, what are some of the opportunities that we can be embracing now, given that, you know, as Ian has said and has Rebecca has said, that these are discussions that have been ongoing for some time. All right, Nick, I'm going to hand over to you now to have a chat about your experience of using eConsent platforms.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks to Ian and Rebecca for doing my work for me, because I've largely sort of captured much of the background to why I was so compelled by the Consentic model to want to implement it at Epworth Healthcare. Most people who may know me know that I've worked mostly as a cancer biologist, but working in biobanking and recruitment of patients into quite complex studies, both in Australia and internationally. And I think the barrier that we've always been presented with, we constructed a basic leaflet, and we wrote it together with health consumers. I did that back in 2001. And I was challenged at the time that such a leaflet, such a simple little trifold leaflet, wouldn't cut it, that in fact I needed a 10-page biobank consent form, which was the kind of document that was in practice at the time. And when I spoke to health consumers, and we spent quite a bit of time with Genetic Support Council and with the Health Consumers Council in WA, revising it, the question to me was always from the consumers, who's this for? Is this for the ethics committee? Is this for your lawyers? Or is this actually to tell us what we want in our, and what's going to happen to us if we participate? And the answer, sadly, I think, as Ian and others, and I'm going to throw kerosene on the lap of people who've dropped the cigarette down their pants, is I think consent has become a ritual that no one is actually properly paying attention to. We don't train people in how to discuss things with people and how to obtain their consent. There's an assumption that everyone knows what they're doing. We don't examine the circumstances in which that's done. I think I've certainly seen instances of consent forms being approved and trials going ahead where there is, to my mind, a real difficulty in the clinical presentation of presenting this information at the time the person comes to the hospital. So at Epworth, we certainly have recognised this now, and the challenges of COVID-19 have made it even more so, because we had to shut our pre-admission clinic for the orthopaedic service that we run. And so in reality, we now do that in a telehealth practice. And one of the other things that I think I'd really want to stress about this is that we treat research as though it's somehow different to clinical practice, and it isn't. It's an extension of clinical practice where we freely admit that we don't actually have a perfect treatment for the patients, for the people that come to our hospitals. I was at once asked, you know, how long would the research study go for in the biobank? And I said, well, until we have a cure for cancer with no side effects. So the reality is that the research is an integral part of clinical care. We don't actually necessarily do consent to procedures as well as we might. Doctors will do that very much in their practice. And when I visited Rebecca, that was at Royal North Shore, that was the thing that impressed me so much about her commitment to real communication with patients. I sat in the outpatient clinic you know, it's a nice room, but it was like a cattle yard in some respects, you know, hundreds of patients, hugely busy. How, when you're rushing through such a clinic, can you give information in a real sensitive way and make sure that people are fully across all of the information that they need? So the opportunity to be able to reach out into a person's home and deliver information, to have interactions, to give them links to obtain information that they might want to get from other sources, and to test whether or not they actually believe what's being said to them, and they can lean on those hopefully reliable sources. So I think very much for me, eConsent in the clinic is, and in the clinical trials we run, and we're about to launch another example of an electronic consent process for another one of our orthopedic studies funded through the NHMRC as a result of having to adapt to the impact of COVID-19, is that it's a real opportunity to rethink consent completely, to really focus in on what patients have an expectation of the communication with them. And as Rebecca said, you increase recruitment not because you are more convincing, but because you can reach more people, and because you can give them the information in a variety of different ways. And so the pool of people that are potentially able to participate in research increases. So if the denominator increases, and you could still have the same percentage of people who agree to participate, but you'll have an increased participation rate. And so I think what we see very much is that this will be the way of the future, and that you know, the slavish adherence to 15, 16-page paper information consent forms, which I personally loathe, I think we'll move well away from that, and we'll consider that to have been, it was reasonably enlightened in 999, but it's certainly not appropriate for today.
Thanks, Nick. That's great, and we can all put the kerosene can down now and continue on. Leanne, over to you to give us a bit of a summary of the work of CTIQ. And I know that eConsent has been one of their core projects as part of their foundational work. So we're keen to hear from you on what those outcomes were and what's next.
Thanks so much, Mel. Welcome everyone, and thank you again, Mel, for this opportunity to speak to you all today from lockdown in Melbourne. I have a slightly unstable internet connection, I think, because everyone is online, so we'll see how we go. So as Mel mentioned, I'll be speaking from the perspective of CTIQ. From those of you who don't know, CTIQ acts as a platform for stakeholder voices across the clinical trials sector to come together to work on improvement projects. We bring together government and industry and researchers and sites and HRECs and interest groups and consumers. So following our launch, we held our first ever steering committee meeting in December 2018. And eConsent was certainly a hot topic. So what we were hearing from our stakeholders is that largely consent forms, as you've heard from the other speakers today, are getting longer and they're getting worse, not better, despite the initiatives of various groups. So despite the availability, there's actually been very limited uptake and use of eConsent technologies and applications to augment and enhance the communication in the medical setting. So we launched a project in 2019 in partnership with Chrysalis Advisory, and Nick Zepps actually was part of that project as he consulted to Chrysalis. And the purpose of that project was really to gain a greater understanding of the current use and adoption of eConsent, and to investigate the barriers to uptake of eConsent within the Australian clinical trial context, and then create really actionable insights to support increased adoption of the technology. So the project included a large survey and in-depth interviews, and you can read the findings for yourself in our report, which is on our website. We've also just published a summary and reflection of that finding in the Medical Journal of Australia just last month. So setting aside the technical difficulties, which are almost all readily surmountable, there was a belief expressed in the surveys and the interviews that HRECs wouldn't view eConsent favourably, and that participants themselves would have concerns. So the purpose of the 2020 piece of work that Nick's also involved in is to showcase several examples using eConsent platforms in use across Australia from the perspective of both the project and the HREC that approved them. So through the use cases, researchers can review how it's being used and reach out to those who have done so for advice. And similarly, HRECs can provide the use cases to those potentially interested in using the eConsent platforms to guide them as to what has been successfully implemented and what the requirements are to receive approval. So the idea is that through the natural process of greater usage and experience, we believe that eConsent will gradually be regarded as no different to the paper-based standard informed consent processes we use today. Certainly we can't see any evidence that it raises any new ethical concerns. So we'll be launching that library of use cases towards the end of this week with just an initial 3 with 9 more to come. So they'll have examples across Australia, all the different jurisdictions, public and private institutions, paid and free platforms. So as some of you have indicated, the sector's hand has really been forced to embrace digital solutions during this time of COVID. So I'm really excited to see where we can go with this, because it's only going to benefit the participant more.
Thanks, Leanne, and that's really exciting to hear that those case studies are going to be available so that others can see in a very practical and pragmatic way how to use them. Now, before we go into some of our questions that we've prepared ahead of time, Ian, while we've got you and before you have to run away to clinic, I've got a question here, and this is from Kate White, who's a HREC member and possibly a researcher. And she makes a very valid point and says that the presenters have all raised critical points, none of them being new, and these discussions have been quite circular for some time. But how do we meaningfully influence the way this is addressed and the expectations at all levels, including HRECs, researchers who argue for universal consent, and also potentially health departments who set unrealistic turnaround times, which has perhaps been driven by pharma to speed up approval processes?
I'm happy to take a little bit of that. You know, it isn't actually new. Of course it isn't new. The question about how do we convey information to people and about what research really is an important one. But I think the idea that we can convey all this information in a patient information sheet and that the ethics committee scrutinises that and then approves it without taking into account the broader conversation that actually occurs with participants. I mean, there are a few questions here about if you use an animation, how do questions get answered? Well, I think we haven't been able to present the entire way that this works. So the animation is a component of a complex interaction with the patient. The surgeon themselves will have a lengthy discussion about the procedure. They'll talk to them about their options. They'll provide this information at the end. Remember that particular study wasn't an interventional study. It was about rehabilitation. That can be represented many times. There is conversations that occur with the surgeon. There's discussions that can occur with the physiotherapist and the research nurse at any time. And of course, the information can also be presented in a paper manner or in traditional means. Really, what we're talking about here is a multi-pronged approach to ensuring that people get the information they need and can make a truly informed decision and be autonomous about the fact that they wish to participate. That's really what we're driving at here. And I think that this is an evolution of the existing system, but it isn't new. You're quite right about that.
Good. Melanie, can I just follow on from that? I think Kate's question, which is a very good one, has the answer built into the question, is that there needs to be lots of discussion at all levels about the inadequacy of our thinking about consent, and just principally to encourage a willingness to look at different ideas about consent. As Nick said, there are a range of models out there. I mean, if you look at Register 4, for example, so in the US, there's different models of getting consent for biobanking research that have an ongoing iterative relationship between the owner of the biosample and the record, and the researchers that they know, and the biobank that they know, but also ones that they don't know. And they can request information, they can email questions through, they can join new projects, they can drop off projects, they can restrict different types of access at different times to a range of different projects. So even just bringing this kind of development or this kind of technology to people's awareness, to get a sense of excitement, so that we can think very broadly about what can be done. I think that in itself would sort of compel a bit more enthusiasm for change, because there's benefits here for consumer groups, there's benefits for the research participants, there's certainly benefits for the researchers. There are significant challenges to be overcome. In some situations there are significant upfront costs, so some of these are, it would be Pollyanna-ish to suggest it would be a very easy thing to do, but having multiple conversations and multiple discussions about what would be possible would be a very good start.
Excellent, thanks, Ian and Nick. We might, there's some great questions coming up in both the chat and the Q&A. Can I just remind people, if you can, please use the Q&A panel so it's easier for me to be finding the questions to present to our panelists. But we might, and this is a question, and I'm going to hand this over to you, Leanne. The benefits are probably fairly obvious to most, but do you want to outline what the CTIQ findings were from the work that was done over 2019?
Yes, and I can speak more broadly as well. I think, as Rebecca has outlined beautifully, the benefits of eConsent accrue most importantly to the participant, but also to sites and HRECs and sponsors. So for participants, number one, it's equity of access to clinical trials. So importantly, it's possible to include functionalities to support other languages in eConsent, as well as support vulnerable populations such as pediatrics or the visually impaired. And there's also an opportunity to provide information in a much more convenient way to a participant who's not able to actually physically attend a clinic, for example, now in the time of COVID. So it removes also the OH&S risk in terms of touching a physical consent form, which is also a consideration right now. Uses technology that it's already regularly used in everyday life, so it's quite familiar. Importantly, it increases comprehension and retention of information compared to a long, lengthy, sometimes 30-page consent form that's quite complex. It allows study participants to choose their preferred method of learning. And it empowers them to make a much more informed decision whether to participate. And then for sites, some of those benefits overlap, but primarily it provides information around a study participant's level of understanding during the consent process, particularly if there's a Q&A built into the consenting platform. It lowers the burden on site staff. As Rebecca mentioned, 3 hours spent consenting a patient, if that can be better spent focusing on what's more important, including study-specific questions and answers and concerns. I think that's really valuable. It also reduces paperwork and quality risks and problems with version control. And then for HRECs, it increases the confidence that the quality of the consenting process is high and therefore improves overall protection for participants. And then finally, for sponsors, there's possible impacts for recruitment in a positive way, and because participants are much more engaged, they're much more likely to remain in the study. And this in turn can really decrease the time it takes for clinical trials to be completed and medical advancements to reach patients. So There's also an ability to track consent in a portable way, so that facilitates remote monitoring and an ability to continuously improve the consenting process as well, because you are getting that feedback loop. They're probably
Excellent.
the main points.
Yeah, no, that's great, Leanne, and hopefully we will address some more of those opportunities as the discussion continues. But I've got a question here to the panel, and this is from Liz Boyce. So to what extent can eConsent and related technologies be used to help healthcare professionals to improve their own communications? So in the context of surrounding conversations that Nick had mentioned, and how do they improve clarity and consistency across conversations with different participants? And I think that's a really important question, because this is about, you know, inclusion of diverse populations.
I think it's maybe I could jump in. It's a great question. I think with an unsophisticated eConsent platform, it may do little to improve communication. I think if an eConsent platform is sophisticated and built into a relationship, then you know, to provide opportunities for further discussion, including some face-to-face, including by, you know, utilizing perhaps different genres or modes of communication, then I think it's got lots of opportunities, because it'll create opportunities for questions. Questions are a problem because they have to, you know, generate an answer, right? And an answer has to come from an expert who's prepared to give that answer. So creating space for questions has got to be good. Giving more information that's tailored to somebody's specific circumstances, that has to be good, because again, that might create questions, and it might create, you know, more informed consumers. And all of those things arguably are going to positively impact upon both the relationship and the broader thinking about somebody's therapy and their life circumstances. So I think lots of opportunities to improve things.
Thanks, Ian. So Nick, the question up on the screen I'm going to pose to you, and I think there's some great questions coming up in the Q&A and in the chat panel, so thank you so much. And many of them are around the barriers that exist towards the implementation of eConsent. So I wondered, Nick, if you can talk to what some of the barriers are, and with particular reference to integration of things like electronic medical records, and also, you know, the lack of a streamlined approach. And who is responsible here, sponsors or sites?
So there's a lot of questions that have been coming in. I've sort of been trying to keep up with the Q&A that's around this. And it's actually very interesting, because I think we've arrived at a point where we've almost lost sight of the purpose of consent. It's all about the compliance end of it rather than a communication with a person. And, you know, the fact that I think Janelle Bowden's asked a question about ethics committees are going to make sure that the patient reads every single word, so that you know, everything has to be written down in the consent form. Or how do we, others have said, how do we change text and how do we reconsent people if we change a couple of words? And I think that's just emblematic of the greater problem about communication. We know that most of our participants don't actually read the patient information sheet and consent forms because they're simply too long. We don't test them, we don't examine them to make sure that they've understood everything. So the question about why haven't we adopted electronic forms of presenting information I think it has been one about cost, it has been one about opportunity, and to some extent, some of the other questions sort of related to me was, I took a leap. I had to dig into one of my budgets to pay for the animation. I had to speak with the surgeons, and we had to shepherd it through the ethics committee to see whether or not they would consider the information to be appropriate. I think of interest, and it's again another one of the questions that comes up, is saying, well, what do ethics committees think? And it'll be on the CTIQ website. Out of all the conversations I've had with ethics committees, not one has said anything other than this is an improvement to the way that information is conveyed to participants. In fact, and we want to dispel that myth immediately. It's similar, you know, questions have come up about the barriers being the technology platforms and the fact that the demographics of the population mean that they won't have accessibility. We certainly haven't found that in our clinics, and it's joint replacement clinics, and we know that a lot of people are actually having devices and using those devices into their 90s. So, you know, the idea that there's some demographic that's excluded. And in fact, I would also say that there's an opportunity here, particularly for culturally and linguistically diverse populations, for proper translations to be put in place, which broaden the accessibility of trials more generally, because there is actually the issue that a lot of them start with their selection criteria of must speak English, which is an immediate barrier to participation for those populations. So I think the barriers are largely because people just haven't either thought to do it, or they have thought it might be too expensive and maybe they don't have the resources to do it, or they don't understand that necessarily it's only one component of the entire process, but it has the opportunity to make things more efficient, and ultimately is an investment, should be seen as an investment rather than a cost.
Thanks, Nick. And I think you've raised some important points there, but coming back to the issue around accessibility and what data are we gathering? And Rebecca, you might be able to assist with this to provide evidence that actually accessibility to patient populations, whether they be already marginalised groups or older populations or CALD groups, that actually eConsent will increase the ability to reach these populations. Are we gathering evidence, or is it all still very anecdotal?
It's still anecdotal, but I can tell you anecdotally that the age barrier doesn't exist. We've had 96-year-olds use the platform successfully. It's really simple to use. Most individuals these days do have a smartphone, so they can access the consent on that. If they don't have a smartphone, most people have the internet and a computer. So if the platform is simple enough to use, age is certainly not a barrier. What I would say about non-English speaking background and minority groups, there's more work to be done, and we're looking into translating both the animations as well as the questions into the 5 top languages. Obviously, the barrier with that is a cost barrier, because that does add on the cost of a trial, but it certainly would increase the recruitment of diverse populations.
Thank you. So there's been a number of questions in the Q&A around the role of the sponsor in supporting and promoting the use of eConsent. Does anybody want to comment about that as a barrier? No? Okay, we'll move on. Nick, are you still that you're with us?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's move on to another question. And again, these are really important considerations. And I'm going to ask you, Rebecca, to assist us with this one. So what are some of the legal considerations that surround the use of eConsent, such as privacy? And as an example, is audiovisual media legally robust? And we have had a number of questions about things like privacy and identifiability in the channels.
Yes, so for consent obviously to be valid, the person must understand the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, and they must have the ability to and have the opportunity to ask questions. And so this eConsent, it's not suggesting that someone would just watch an animation, answer the question, sign, and that would be it. One would also want to make sure that they had a conversation, had the opportunity to ask and clarify any questions that they had, and providing all that had been done, then yes, that would be a legally valid process. In terms of privacy in Australia, any electronic medical records need to be hosted on servers in Australia, and obviously there needs to be tight data encryption to make sure that all of the healthcare records are protected. So that's something that needs to be ensured by any eConsent platform. So I would say that certainly it is legally robust, providing the person that we've clarified that they do understand and they have had the opportunity to ask questions. And The other thing to say is that electronic signatures are also acceptable and legal.
And we're certainly seeing, certainly the reports that we're hearing is that the use of e-signatures is now becoming much more accepted, really across Australia, which is a very small but significant achievement. So what about identifiability then? So how do we maintain confidentiality, particularly if ownership of these platforms lies with the sponsor? How do we manage that?
Melanie, just as a brief digression, I was amused to see that with federal parliament returning for the first time in 2 months today, that the people our elected ministers could attend, or senators and ministers could attend in person, or they could attend by video link. But if they attended by video link, then they were not allowed to vote because they couldn't be identified as being a voting minister. So this is clearly an issue that that is operating at a political level as well as in the research context as well. So hopefully at least one person will turn up in Canberra.
Okay, let's talk, let's go to our next question, because many of these, so we've talked about advanced age and access to these technologies. Bear with me, let me go back. Okay, compliance. Leanne, this is a question for you, and we have had a number of questions in the Q&A panel. Does an eConsent application need to comply with regulations such as 21 CFR Part 46, GCP and other local regulations?
Oh no.
I can answer that.
Oh, I'm back. Can you hear me? I'll
Yes, you're there.
I'll stop my video because it's just saying unstable. Sorry, guys.
You're okay.
So in essence, yes, of course, the informed consent application must still contain all of the required elements of conformed consent as per local laws and regulations. So as Rebecca's just outlined, the main two principles of informed consent as per ICH GCP and the Code of Federal Regulations and EU signature categories and the national statement are to provide study participants with the information they need to make an informed decision whether to participate in a study. And then the ICF obviously serves as a tool for enhancing that dialogue. And then the second element is documenting that the participant provided consent. So in essence, yes, but when it comes to eConsent, the TGA hasn't actually made any comment around the use of eConsent, but the FDA released some guidance in December 2016, the use of electronic informed consent, Q&A for investigator sponsors and HREX, and they're quite supportive, and they've actually followed up with some guidance this year during COVID, and all of those elements are consistent with the national statement.
So if I might as well, I just sort of want to build on that, that the Australian regulations are the national statement and the TGA comment on the ICH GCP. And so I always smile when I see questions like this, because there's actually no substantive difference between the requirements of the national statement and anything that's in GCP and anything that's in 21 CFR Part 46. And I'd just be really curious as to anyone who can point out the differences between those documents and where there's inconsistencies, because I've never seen it. So you could simply have this question as, is it consistent with the national statement? And the answer is yes, of course it is. Because again, it's that whole, oh, well, we've got to do the checkbox type of mentality on this, and has it met all the regulations? But if you look at the dimensions of consent, of providing information to make an informed decision to participate in research that is outlined in the national statement, it's fairly straightforward. And no ethics committee that I'm aware of would approve anything that didn't at least address those elements. So I can't see there being any problems at all.
Excellent, thank you. And I totally echo your
Yeah, I would agree
sentiments.
with that as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Leanne and Nick, there are certainly no barriers. We'll happily share, as we have previously, the FDA updated guidance around eConsent, but it is just really about valid consent and making sure that the tenets of valid consent are adhered to. Okay, panelists, are there any questions that you've seen that you want to particularly address? Otherwise, I'll keep going with our formulated questions and then we can come back to the questions that have been posed in both the chat and the Q&A forum. Because particularly, I think there's an issue that we need to discuss around updating information. So for amendments, and also about cost. So let's address the cost issue first. And Rebecca, are you happy to address this? So what are the costs of access to platforms such as Consentic, as an example? So if you were a new site or a sponsor and this was your first foray into eConsent, what might that look like as a single site study?
Yes, so the main costs with using Consentic is obviously the development of the animation, because the animation is a bespoke animation and essentially is converting the PICF into a story that patients can really access and understand. There's cost involved with that. So our current cost with that, which is very cheap, is $6,000. And then to access our platform, it's $10 per consent. So it's overall not a particularly expensive platform, but it obviously depends what the study budget is.
Thanks, Rebecca. Does anybody else want to comment on costs? And so particularly when there's an update, Rebecca, how is that managed on a platform like Consentic?
So the animation is just revised and resubmitted to ethics for approval, and then it's just re-uploaded onto the platform. And if the revisions are minor, it doesn't take very long.
So Melanie, that's a really good point. I think one of the things that came out when we did a discussion with other groups about their use of electronic consent, which isn't just an animation, but it's a whole range of additional pieces, is what is a substantive ethical change and what is a non-substantive ethical change. And I've come across that a number of times, that people saying, well, we've got to reconsent the patient during COVID-19 because we're going to be giving access to sponsors to look at electronic versions of doing their monitoring. Now, that seemed really odd because it's not a substantive ethical issue that affects the safety of and their participation. So the question is, can you provide information to a person that is relevant to their ongoing participation in the study? Now, you can do that by a telephone call. You can do that by going to see them. You can do that in a letter. So there are numerous other ways that you can provide information to a person and say, something has arisen, we think you need to know about it. Are you willing to continue your participation? Reconsent is nonsense. They're not reconsenting. They're indicating their intention to stay in the study and not withdraw in the light of new information. So I think we need to be more precise with our language about that also.
Thanks, Nick. So we've got a question here in regard to the use of broad consent. Bear with me because I've just lost it now. Okay, so, and Ian, this might be something that you want to tackle. So the use of eConsent for high-risk projects, and the example given here is genomics and broad consent. Whether they're high risk, I guess, is debatable. But examples to date still say that for the provision of biosamples for further research, that consent needs to be done face-to-face. Do you want to comment on that statement or question, Ian?
Well, where's the requirement written anywhere that that's the case? I'm not aware of it. And in fact, one of our examples that we'll be presenting on the CTIQ webpage, and what actually is done in another project I'm involved in through Queensland University of Technology, using dynamic consent, which is actually where people can log into a system and have an enduring relationship with the researchers, in the sense of they can own the participation. They can go in, they can look at new information, they can answer new questionnaires, they can withdraw if they like. New information can be presented in those ways. There's nothing to say that a person who's acting as an autonomous being can't decide to participate, even over a phone call. At the end of the day, it's up to a person to make a decision based on the information that they have. And the question is, were they aware of all the implications? So I think that the idea, I don't know where it snuck in, that it has to be done face to face and it can't be done any other way. I just don't know where that's come from.
Yeah, and I guess that really comes into the topic around dynamic consent, which is, again, something that is being managed remotely and online, and gives participants the ability to be able to opt in for ongoing use of their samples held in biorepositories. And that is primarily, as I said, done online. So I agree with you, Nick. I'm not sure where the requirement comes from that would need to be face-to-face, because it's certainly not common practice. All right, let's go to the next question. And Rebecca, again, over to you. So how easy is it to adapt an existing platform for a new study? And can researchers and sites, can they have the ability to do that themselves? And how hard is it to learn those skills and apply them to these technologies?
So Consentic's a very easy platform to use. A person could log in and figure it out for themselves within about 5 minutes. It's really, really simple. The only thing that needs to be entered are the patient details, and then it's very, very intuitive. So in terms of, you know, adopting, staff training, it takes a total of 5 to 10 minutes. The uploading of animations and altering the questions, which are specific for a clinical trial, that's obviously done on the Consentic side of things, and it's all discussed with trial sites before those questions are developed. So that's on our end. In terms of languages, that requires back-end development, because the platform has to be architected in a different way, and that's something that we are working on for the future and hope will be available. That will really increase accessibility to non-English speaking background patients and minority groups as well.
So here's another question, Rebecca, around building consent platforms, and roughly how much time should be factored for the development of an eConsent. So if a client came to you, as an example, with a PIS ICF, how long would that process take from the day they hand over to you to the platform being ready for HREC submission?
About 4 weeks.
Okay. All right, let's keep going. So this question, Nick, and with your experience with actually using a platform for a clinical trial in clinic, how do we manage version control?
So it depends on how the information is presented to a person in the first place. So is there a block of information which is this is the generic information which is unlikely to ever change? And is there then specific information which may change and so that might be the a new disclosure of a risk. It might be the new disclosure about a change to the schedule about when people come into the clinic. Now, all of that, it's not just simply a question. I mean, we do it in a way where I've seen that it's just a rewrite of the whole information sheet and consent form, and then that's represented in its entirety, rather than a short letter that says, this tiny element has changed. Does this affect your intention to continue participation? Now, if it's the latter, then that's very easy to deliver. It's no different to deliver than it would be for an existing system, because you're getting contact with the participant and you present the information to them. So I think, again, this sort of smacks of the have we really thought through how we present information to people in the first place, and what is substantive and what is non-substantive information, and about that conversation that we have with them? Because what's been assumed here to some extent is, whether we do e-consent or whether we do paper consent, is that we never talk to the person again. Well, for most of the clinical trials, they're in quite lengthy follow-up. And so we have numerous opportunities to represent information and to have ongoing Q&As about things that occur with a patient. So, I mean, it is never a single point in time during that participation. And then once it's into long-term follow-up where there's no further participation, the question is the new information relevant to the person and their risk? Yet, well, now if it was something to do with, we've suddenly learned something that we ought to tell you about the potential long-term side effects, well, it doesn't matter whether it's paper or e-consent, you'll get back in touch with the person to let them know, like a recall. So I just don't think that there's any really different issue here.
So, Rebecca, I've got this question for you, but Nick, you might also want to jump into this one. I think Ian has had to leave. And this again returns to the question around privacy. And Robert, who's a lawyer on a HREC, asks, the privacy content of patient consent forms is incomprehensible even to a lawyer. So how can that be simplified? Should privacy be dealt with in some other ways? So how are we doing that in e-consent platforms?
Well, I mean, again, that just comes down to how do we give information in the first place? I've read 1.5 pages of a privacy statement on a commercial studies disclosure, which could be summarized as, we will abide by the Privacy Act and keep your information secure. I mean, it's just, you know, how long does it actually need to be comprehensible? So I think that's it's not different between e-consent and paper versions. It's an old chestnut of, well, how much information and how should that information be provided? And we all know that none of us read the information disclosures for software updates and for signing away our rights and responsibilities to Apple and other organizations. So the key question is, what are the pieces of information that a person needs to know that you're making promises? And it's actually very interesting. Malcolm Crompton, the former Privacy Commissioner, has provided some very nice examples of how to do this well and how not to do this well. And you know, Malcolm will be very well known to Praxis and to Belbury and others. And he's provided a lot of advice to us as to how to manage the privacy issues. And so I think, again, it really comes down to an appropriate disclosure of the meaningful risk. And that then comes down to institutional responsibilities. Epworth has a declaration about how it manages privacy more generally, and we can direct people to our privacy policy, and most organizations will have privacy policies.
Great, thanks, Nick. So if we then turn to the use of animation, why animation? Is that the best way to tell the story that we need to tell about research? Or are there other ways that we can approach e-consent that still use truncated methods, but don't necessarily have to include the use of animations? Particularly if that's where there's a lot of cost.
I think there are absolutely multiple different ways. I think one of the problems is if you have a clinician that's filmed, perhaps delivering the information, clinicians aren't necessarily the best communicators, and then you don't get the audio-visual side of things, which can really depict things pictorially to patients. And I think that's the power of animation, that instead of having just words, you then all of a sudden have this, you know, it's a story, which really makes it so clear to patients. So I think that's the true benefit of animation. But I do think other interactive platforms or having other ways to engage patients is also really valuable. In my view, I think animations engage patients in a way that other platforms don't do so well.
So I guess what's important to note out of this discussion is that there is the ability with the available platforms for sites to be actively involved in making sure that the information that they are giving to their participants is robust. The ethics committees can get involved in that discussion as well. So it's not just a single, you know, you provide a solution and this is it. It really is an iterative and a very collaborative approach. Is that right, Rebecca?
Absolutely. And the site is heavily involved as well in the versions of the animation and changing it to make sure that it's how they want the information to be represented. We obviously do this, so we're very good at taking a PICF and converting it into a story, and most of the time that's well accepted, but certainly if there are additions, then we can easily make them.
Great, and there's some good suggestions coming up in the Q&A panel about how we could have, you know, some sort of centralised repository of some of those animations that people can do a pick and select option, which would be fantastic. Okay, so then there's a question, Virginia has posed a question about capacity. So how would you use eConsent for participants with different levels of cognitive capacity? Example being the use in dementia research or other mental health issues. And I think this is a really important question. So who would like to tackle that?
Well, I don't think that they could consent, so they would need their guardian probably to consent on their behalf if they didn't have the capacity.
So that responsibility is retained with the researcher, obviously, to do an assessment of capacity. Correct. And their ability. So whether that be ongoing involvement in a study or initial involvement. Nick, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
So Melanie, again, this is, like I say, it's not new. The animations and various things like that are tools in the toolbox that enable us to communicate with the person, and they're not the sole method. So there's always going to be an evaluation of the competency of the person and their individual needs when you're meeting with them and speaking with them about their potential participation. So I'm coming obviously from a very clinical background, but there's other areas where, if it was universities and various other things where they're reaching out to a broader population or in community settings. And again, it's really up to an individual saying, have I received enough information to be able to make a decision for myself? So I think whether it's in a paper form or whether it's an electronic form, it's not actually different. What we're suggesting is that the electronic forms provide some additional advantages, because we can also see how long a person has spent on various bits of the information, because it collects metadata in the background. We can insert small tests into the format that allows people to answer questions, and so we can actually really understand whether they whether they understand it or not. And if they don't, there are trigger points that say, well, either we won't enroll this person, or we'll loop back to them. There'll be a person that will use that as a prompt sheet to speak with them about their understanding of their participation. So I think it's really that multifaceted approach. And I know there's been a lot of questions saying, well, how does this make it any cheaper? In fact, this looks like it's more expensive and things like that. I guess the whole point is, we want to communicate better with our participants and make sure they understand what they're getting into. And when you do research, you need to invest in that. What we're suggesting is that there may be benefits in terms of how that information is delivered before they come to see us, so that those people who can pretty much get through the information, they fully understand it, they can get on with it and ask the pointed questions, which saves some time. And then we can spend more time with those people that really need to have their questions answered. And so I think it provides significant tailoring to individuals than we presently have.
So how does the system work then when participants do have questions? So if they're going through the discussion online and they have a question, are there forums within the consent option where they can write their questions at the time, or perhaps do a video recording? How is that interaction with the research team managed?
With our platform, they can write their questions and then that will be flagged with the team through the platform. So that's the way, and that will prompt a phone call or a further discussion. But most of the time, in any case, this wouldn't just be sent to the patient and them just to be left. Yeah, that's it. There would often be a follow-up phone call and a further discussion in any case.
And I guess that's a key point of this whole discussion today, is remembering, and as you mentioned, Nick, that consent is not just compliance. You know, consent, valid consent is a process, and eConsent is a part of that process. And the benefits or the virtues of eConsent is accessibility, and it is getting information through in a way that, you know, we know is going to make understanding more credible, because there's a dearth of literature that mentions the fact that people don't currently understand the information that's given in traditional paper-based platforms. Okay, so another question here from Janelle, and we're getting close to the end of the session, and we've had some fabulous questions, many of them on a theme. So if we haven't answered all of them, it's because I think we've answered some of them in the questions that we have already posed. But this comes back again to identifiability. So how do we verify that the person that signed the eConsent was in fact the participant? And how do we make allocation for cultures where the family or others may be involved in agreeing to the participation in research?
So I might sound a bit like a broken record there, but how is that different to the paper? How do you know in any situation that a person who signed the consent form is the actual person? So there are, and you know, the way that you would do that is that they've come into the appointment, you've used various means by which you can identify that it is the person in front of you, they've filled in their demographic information, and you sort of assess, I'm talking in from the clinical point of view, you would assess why they've come in with a particular medical problem to you. So again, the question would be, why on earth would anyone want to sign a consent form for which they are not the participant? And the FDA is very pragmatic about this. Their advice is very much, don't make eConsent do anything more than you would do for paper-based consent forms. So, you know, I know there's this question in some of the guidance, it's like, hold up your ID in front of you. Now, one thing about eConsent and electronic signatures in general, if I might just digress onto that, is they are far more robust than wet ink signatures. We at Epworth have gone fully over to electronic signatures for all research documentation and governance, simply because it provides additional two-factor authentication of who signed it, when, how, and there's numerous ways in which eConsent is actually far more robust than a wet ink signature. The question about, you know, when it's done through at a cultural level, well, that's a broader question. And if we were looking at an individual project where that might actually be the case, then we would be saying, okay, well, the eConsent model has to take that into account. Where that is the situation in a direct clinical participation, the way that Australia deals with that is still very much that it's the individual that gives their consent. So, you know, from a legal sense, that's who we're waiting for to give their agreement. But, you know, clinically, someone signs an eConsent a week before they come into hospital. What we do in our project is we confirm that consent with them when they come into admission. And we go through that. So a research nurse will meet them, the doctor will check with them, the anaesthetist will check with them. So it's not like we just say, oh yeah, there it was, everyone's good. We'll make sure that we're checking various components on them, such as their tags on their wrist and their ankle when they're going into theatre. So I think to sort of suggest that, you know, it's a complete replacement to processes that are already in place is to misunderstand how this fits into the overarching way that we do work.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And again, we're seeing lots of questions along a similar theme. But one thing that we haven't yet addressed is it relates to Australia's system of multi-centre trial authorisations. So if you've got a site that is the primary site for a multi-centre study, how easy is it to be able to make modifications that are relevant to the sites that sit under that site for a multi-centre study, and how do you validate the site's information and authentication?
So this mystified me a bit. What exactly are we talking about at a site-specific level? So we take a master patient information sheet now. What is site-specific other than the logo of the institution and the contact details on the form? So the reality is we can separate those two things out, because it doesn't make the information on the sheet any different. It just says this is the organisation that is presenting it to you. So I guess I'm just trying to understand why that's a substantive ethical concern.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think you're right, Nick. From it's more of a process question, isn't it, and a compliance question, rather than how does it impact the ethics of eConsent, which is really what we're trying to have the discussion about today. Is, you know, how does eConsent really support valid consent and access to clinical trials? And I think that's what we need to do as a sector, is really try to embrace what are some of those very practical barriers that can be overcome by discussion with your HREC or with your sponsor or with the supplier of the platform, as opposed to the really key and critical barriers which potentially aren't as insurmountable as we might have thought, around making sure that consent applies ethical standards. So So we really are stuck on some of the more practical issues by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
And we are hearing that in the questions. All right, we might.
So there are a few things where people said, oh, there's specific things about reproductive risk statements. I think those kinds of things can be accommodated. And I guess the question is, I want to flag actors' use of some of this kind of information, ironically, on its toolkit for consumers, because they actually have a really nice suite of generic information, which Rebecca's quite familiar with, since her company actually produced some of it. I think there is a place for a national compendium of some consistent messaging about what is a clinical trial, what are the questions to ask of your doctor if I'm going to participate. And I'm talking for interventional type clinical trials as opposed to sort of university-based research. But I think there would be a role for some level of generic information that can be given, that people can click on and say, so explain to me randomization. What is actually randomization? And there are things like that that I think would be very, very useful to build as a national resource, if at all possible. And then we can sort of really hone in on what are the individual concerns that we might have that need to be addressed at sites or are specific to a type of study. So if you were dealing with a pediatric population, or one in cognitive decline, or one who were enrolled and then had their consent subsequent because they were incapacitated at the time of enrollment. So you can see, we're not suggesting there's a one size fits all. It would have to be nuanced.
Absolutely, and again, that's really the main reason for today's discussion, is to really unpack what some of the challenges are. And I think it's reassuring to hear that most of the challenges are actually understanding what are more practical issues, rather than what are issues that would really be road stoppers with a HREC. So one final question, and I think then we might finish up the conversation. And again, thank you all for your involvement. There's been 80 odd, nearly 90 odd questions posed during the session. So this is obviously an area for ongoing discussion. But is an investigator signature required on an eConsent form as well as a participant signature?
So what does that attest to? So I think, again, it's this thing we had for many years, the idea of a witness signature. And when I was on an ethics committee, Charles Gardner, a hospital in Perth, and I was chair. I asked the question of a lawyer friend, and I said, why do we have a witness signature? This is all causing lots of difficulties. And the lawyer said, there's actually no valid reason why you have a witness signature on the participant consent form. They're not attesting to what, that the person is truly the person that they said, that they understand it, and what utility would that have in a court of law? So there is no requirement for a witness signature on a participant information sheet consent form right now, anywhere. So, you know, any institution that still requires that, they should stop. So then the question is, what is the signature of the investigator? Well, you can still give, and I signed several this morning, where I countersign a document that has been signed by another person. Now, the question is, under the Electronic Transaction Act, and Jacqueline has commented on this, about if you read the various state and federal Electronic Transaction Acts, it says that the two people have to be in the same room and things of that nature. That is for deeds. You don't necessarily, if you're not acting as a witness, but you're countersigning a document, there's a different view. So I think there would need to be maybe some clarity in the Act, or certainly an interpretation. But if you go to a lot of the websites of legal firms that have commented on this, and you look at the case law that's arisen around it, I don't think there's actually a problem. So I think the idea is that the investigator will still countersign the document on the basis of a person having signed it and having an authentication of their intent to sign and participate.
Great. Thanks, Nick. So, look, I'm just going to hand to the panelists now. So, any final comments or remarks in regard to what we've been hearing on the discussion today, and your personal views on how we can progress the implementation of eConsent technologies in Australia? So, Leanne, can I start with you?
Yes, I caught half of that. But in terms of final comments, I would just say, I guess from our own perspective, as a shameless plug, check out our use cases, because we'll just be providing really practical, pragmatic examples of where it's successfully being used in Australia. And I think that will give the sector some confidence and give them some different ideas as to how it's being utilised.
That's great, Leanne, because it sounds like confidence is a real issue when we're hearing from our audience. Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, a lot of the questions have related to the legalities or requirements of the institutions or organisations, and I think the focus really needs to be, what is the purpose of consent? And the purpose of consent is to inform patients about their entry into a clinical trial. So I think that eConsent platforms can do that really well. And most of the concerns that have been raised today they're the same concerns that one would have with paper consent. So I don't necessarily think that eConsent changes any of those factors hugely. I think it's the same, and ultimately we should be trying our best to empower patients and provide them with information that makes them understand health better.
Fantastic, Rebecca. That's a great summary. And Nick?
No, Rebecca said it really well.
Yeah, I think you did too, Rebecca.
It's about informing people and using flexible means to do so.
Absolutely. And, you know, I guess, you know, we have an ethical and moral imperative to do that and to help to minimise some of those barriers that you presented in your initial presentation, Rebecca. So I would like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank all of our audience today. This has certainly been one of the most lively discussions that we've been involved in, and we really do appreciate your involvement. If you do have specific questions that we didn't get to and you would like to address them to the panelists, please feel free to send the question through to us at Praxis and with the name of the panelist, and we would be delighted to refer them on. Nick and Rebecca and Leanne, I hope you're happy to take some of those offline if we receive any.
Sure.
And this is a discussion that we need to continue. So today is obviously just an opportunity to begin that. And again, we thank you all. Have a great day and a good week. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all.